I stood in the marble lobby of the Sterling Grand Hotel on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan, watching my family's faces as they stared up at the brass plaque mounted on the wall behind the concierge desk, and the laughter that had filled our family dinner just 2 nights ago died in their throats. If you've ever been underestimated by the people who should believe in you most, if you've ever let others think less of you while you quietly built an empire they couldn't imagine, hit that like button and subscribe, because what I'm about to tell you is a story about patience, strategy, and the sweetest vindication I've ever experienced. My name is Margaret Chin, though everyone calls me Maggie, and I'm 53 years old. I was born in Flushing, Queens, to parents who'd immigrated from Taiwan in the early 70s, part of that wave of Asian families chasing the American dream through the gray slush of New York winters and the suffocating heat of summer subway platforms. My father worked as a line cook in Chinatown, coming home every night smelling like garlic and ginger and hot oil, his hands permanently stained and scarred from years of burns and cuts. My mother sewed in a garment factory in the Fashion District, hunched over an industrial machine for 10 hours a day, her back curved into a permanent question mark by the time she was 40. They worked themselves to exhaustion so my younger brother David and I could have better lives, could go to good schools, could become doctors or lawyers or engineers, the holy trinity of immigrant parent aspirations. But I disappointed them. That was the narrative that had been established in my family for the past 30 years, set in stone like those Chinese characters carved into the memorial stones at the cemetery in Queens where we'd buried my father 8 years ago. I'd disappointed them by dropping out of NYU after my sophomore year, where I'd been studying business administration on a partial scholarship that still left my parents scrambling to cover the rest. I dropped out because I'd gotten a job, a real job with real money, working as a housekeeper at a boutique hotel in Midtown, and the money was too good to pass up when my family needed it so desperately. My father had just been diagnosed with diabetes, the medical bills were piling up, and my mother's factory had cut everyone's hours. Someone had to step up, and David was only 15, still in high school, still with his whole future ahead of him. So I'd stepped up. I'd taken the job making beds and scrubbing toilets and restocking minibars, and I'd been good at it, good enough that within 6 months I was promoted to head housekeeper, managing a team of 12 women, most of them immigrants like my parents, working hard and sending money home to families in Ecuador and Poland and the Philippines. The hotel was called the Madison, a small place with only 48 rooms but a reputation for impeccable service and attention to detail. It was owned by an older man named Robert Sterling, a third-generation hotelier whose grandfather had started with a boarding house in Brooklyn and whose father had built it into a small chain of respectable mid-range hotels across the tri-state area. Robert was in his 60s when I started working for him, silver-haired and elegant, always in a perfectly tailored suit even when he was just checking on the breakfast service or reviewing the housekeeping schedules. He noticed things, small things, the way I'd trained my team to fold the towels so they looked luxurious even though they were standard grade, the way I'd reorganized the supply closets to make restocking more efficient, the way I'd started leaving small touches in the rooms, a piece of chocolate on the pillow, a handwritten note welcoming guests by name. He called me into his office one day, a cramped room behind the front desk that smelled like coffee and old paper, and told me I had a mind for hospitality, that I understood what most people in this business never learned, that it wasn't about the thread count of the sheets or the marble in the bathroom, it was about making people feel seen and cared for. He started teaching me the business, not formally, not like school, but through conversation and observation. He'd have me sit in on meetings with suppliers, let me see the budgets and the profit margins, explain why he made certain decisions about pricing and marketing and staff allocation. He told me about his children, 2 sons and a daughter, none of whom had any interest in the hotel business. The daughter was a doctor in California, one son was a lawyer in Boston, the other son was an investment banker who thought his father's little hotels were quaint and old-fashioned. Robert was building something no one in his family wanted, and I think he saw in me a hunger they'd never had, an appreciation for the work that came from understanding what it meant to really need something. My family didn't see it that way. To them, I was wasting my potential, throwing away my education to clean up after rich people. My mother cried when I told her I wasn't going back to NYU, begged me to reconsider, said they'd find another way to manage the medical bills. My father barely spoke to me for months, his disappointment hanging in the air of our small apartment in Flushing like smoke. And David, brilliant David, who went on to become exactly what they'd hoped, a pediatrician with a practice in Westchester and a big house and a perfect family, he looked at me with something like pity mixed with contempt. At family dinners, when relatives asked what everyone was doing, my parents would talk proudly about David's achievements, his honors at Cornell, his acceptance to Columbia Medical School, his successful practice, and then they'd mumble something vague about me working in hospitality, as if the specifics were too shameful to articulate. But I kept working and I kept learning and I kept saving money. I lived in a tiny studio apartment in Astoria, sharing a bathroom with 3 other apartments on my floor, sleeping on a futon and eating ramen and rice, sending half my paycheck home to my parents and banking the rest. Robert promoted me to assistant manager after 3 years, then general manager after 5. The Madison thrived under my management, our occupancy rates climbing, our reviews glowing, our reputation spreading through word of mouth and eventually through those early travel websites that were just starting to appear in the late 90s. Robert paid me well, better than I could have made in most entry-level positions even with a college degree, and he gave me bonuses when we had good years, bonuses that went straight into my savings account at the credit union in Flushing. When I was 31 years old, Robert called me into his office, but this time it wasn't the cramped room behind the front desk. He'd asked me to meet him at his apartment on the Upper East Side, a pre-war building with a doorman and an elevator operator and the kind of old New York elegance that was already disappearing. His apartment was filled with dark wood furniture and oriental rugs and photographs of hotels. His family's legacy spread across the walls in black and white. He poured us both scotch, expensive stuff from a crystal decanter, and he told me he was sick. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4, maybe 6 months left if the doctors were being optimistic. His children knew, and they'd already made it clear they'd be selling the family's hotel properties as soon as he was gone, liquidating everything to split the inheritance 3 ways. He didn't want that. He didn't want the Madison, his favorite property, the one he'd personally renovated and poured his heart into, to be sold to some chain that would gut it and turn it into another generic business hotel. He wanted it to go to someone who understood it, who loved it the way he did. He wanted it to go to me. But I didn't have the money to buy it outright, not even close. The property was worth maybe $3 million at the time and I had about $200,000 saved. So Robert made me a proposal. He'd sell me 49% of the Madison for everything I had, giving me minority ownership but a real stake in the business. And he'd put in his will that I'd have the first right of refusal to buy the remaining 51% from his estate at a fair market price, with 10 years to come up with the money. It was risky and complicated and probably not what his lawyers recommended, but Robert didn't care. He wanted to give me a chance the same way someone had once given his grandfather a chance. I took the deal. I gave him every dollar I'd saved over 9 years, and I became a part owner of the Madison Hotel. Robert died 7 months later in the spring, and I stood at his funeral in a black dress I'd bought at a discount store, watching his children who barely remembered my name, knowing they thought their father had been a foolish old man for giving away part of their inheritance to the help. The estate settled and I had my 10 years to come up with approximately $1.8 million to buy out their share, accounting for the appreciated value. It seemed impossible. I was making decent money as general manager, but not nearly enough to save that kind of cash in 10 years while still living in New York City. But I had a plan. I'd been developing it in my head for years, watching the hotel industry evolve, seeing the rise of boutique hotels that charged premium prices for unique experiences rather than competing on amenities with the big chains. The Madison was perfect for this transformation, but it needed investment, renovation, repositioning in the market. I needed capital and I needed expertise I didn't have yet. So I did something that seemed crazy to everyone I told. I went back to school. I enrolled in a hospitality management program at a community college, taking night classes after working all day at the hotel. I was 32 years old, sitting in classrooms with kids fresh out of high school, learning about yield management and revenue optimization and brand positioning. I finished my associate degree in 2 years, then transferred to a hospitality management bachelor's program that let me study mostly online and on weekends. It took me 4 more years, 4 years of working 70-hour weeks and studying in whatever spare moments I could find, but I graduated with my bachelor's degree at 38 years old. My parents came to the graduation and I could see they were proud finally that I'd finished what I'd started, but they still introduced me to people as our daughter who manages a hotel, as if management was the ceiling of my ambition. Armed with my degree and my decade of hands-on experience, I started looking for investors. I put together a business plan for renovating and repositioning the Madison as a luxury boutique hotel, targeting business travelers and tourists who wanted personalized service and neighborhood charm rather than corporate uniformity. I pitched it to small investment groups, to wealthy individuals, to anyone who might see the potential I saw. I got rejected dozens of times, told that I didn't have enough collateral, that the hotel industry was too competitive, that I was too inexperienced, that boutique hotels were a fad. But I kept pitching, refining my presentation, learning from every no. And then I met Eleanor Rothschild. Not the famous banking family, just a woman who happened to share the name, a real estate investor in her 70s who'd made a fortune buying and renovating residential properties in Brooklyn before it was fashionable. She came to the Madison because her granddaughter was getting married and had booked a block of rooms for out-of-town guests, and Eleanor had come early to check out the accommodations. I met her in the lobby, gave her a personal tour, and somehow we ended up having coffee in the small cafe next door, talking about real estate and hospitality and the changing face of New York City. She asked about my story and I told her everything: the immigrant parents, the dropped college education, the mentorship with Robert, the minority ownership, and the ticking clock to buy out the estate. Eleanor was quiet for a long time after I finished, stirring her coffee and watching the traffic flow past on 3rd Avenue. Then she said, "I'll lend you the money. Not invest, lend. $2 million at 4% interest 10-year note. You'll use 1.8 to buy out the estate and the rest for renovations. You'll pay me back from the hotel's profits. If you default, I take ownership. If you succeed, you own it free and clear at the end of 10 years, and I'll have made a modest return on my money. But you have to do everything, Maggie. The renovation, the rebranding, the marketing, all of it. I'm not a partner, I'm a lender. This is your vision, your business, your success or failure." I took the deal. I was 39 years old and suddenly I owned the Madison Hotel outright, subject to a $2 million debt that would take a decade to pay off if everything went according to plan. I spent the next year renovating, working with architects and designers to transform the property while keeping the bones of what made it special. We reduced the room count from 48 to 36, making each room larger, adding rainfall showers and soaking tubs and custom furniture. We redid the lobby in a modern style that somehow felt warm instead of cold, all natural light and comfortable seating and local art on the walls. We added a small restaurant that served breakfast and dinner, focusing on locally sourced ingredients and seasonal menus. We trained the staff to provide the kind of personalized service that Robert had always believed in, learning guests' names and preferences, anticipating needs before they were articulated. The new Madison opened when I was 40 years old and it was immediately successful. We charged 3 times what we'd charged before and we were booked solid months in advance. Travel magazines wrote about us, bloggers featured us, celebrities started staying with us because we didn't treat them like celebrities, just like valued guests who deserved privacy and excellent service. The profits were substantial, and every dollar beyond what I needed to live on went to paying down Eleanor's loan and saving for expansion. Because I had bigger plans. I'd been watching a property 2 blocks south on Madison Avenue, an old office building that had been vacant for years, tied up in legal disputes between the owners. When it finally came on the market, I was ready. I'd paid off half of Eleanor's loan in just 5 years through the success of the Madison, and she agreed to extend my credit line to buy and renovate the second property. This one would be bigger, 60 rooms, positioned even more upscale, targeting the luxury market rather than the boutique market. I called it the Sterling Grand, naming it after Robert, the man who'd given me my start and believed in me when no one else did. The Sterling Grand took 3 years to renovate and open, the most stressful 3 years of my life, managing one successful hotel while building another, overseeing construction and design and hiring and training, all while living in the same studio apartment in Astoria because every dollar still went back into the business. But when the Sterling Grand opened its doors on 5th Avenue, just south of Central Park, it was magnificent. Marble lobby, crystal chandeliers that I'd found at an estate sale and had restored, rooms decorated in a style that evoked old New York glamour while incorporating every modern amenity. The restaurant was helmed by a young chef I'd poached from a Michelin-starred establishment, and it became a destination in itself, written up in the New York Times and featured on the Food Network. I was 48 years old and I owned 2 of the most successful boutique hotels in Manhattan. I'd paid off Eleanor's loan in full ahead of schedule and we'd remained friends, having lunch once a month to talk about business and life. I'd moved out of my studio in Astoria finally, buying a modest 1-bedroom condo in Chelsea, nothing extravagant but mine with a doorman and a view of the Hudson River. I employed over 100 people across my 2 properties, many of them immigrants working their first jobs in America. And I paid them well and promoted from within whenever possible, remembering what it had meant to me when Robert had seen my potential. But my family still didn't really understand what I'd built. They knew I owned hotels, that I'd done well for myself, but the specifics were vague to them. My mother thought I owned a couple of small hotels, my brother thought I was doing okay in the hotel business, and the extended family, the aunts and uncles and cousins I saw at holidays and weddings and funerals, they still had that same slightly pitying tone when they asked about my work, as if I was doing fine for someone who'd never quite lived up to their potential. None of them had ever visited the Madison or the Sterling Grand, despite my invitations. They were busy with their own lives, their own concerns, and I think on some level they were still embarrassed by me, still wished I'd become a doctor or lawyer like I was supposed to. It came to a head at my mother's 80th birthday celebration, a big family dinner at a Chinese restaurant in Flushing, the kind with the lazy Susans in the center of round tables and the live fish tanks along the wall. There were about 40 of us, spanning 3 generations, my mother holding court at the center table while everyone toasted her health and longevity. The conversation turned, as it always did, to what everyone was doing, the cousins talking about their jobs in tech and finance, David talking about his medical practice and his teenage children's achievements, his son getting into Yale, his daughter winning a national piano competition. And then someone, I think it was my Aunt Lily, asked me how my little hotel was doing, and something in her tone, that dismissive diminutive, just broke something in me. "It's doing well," I said. "Both of them are doing well, actually. The Madison and the Sterling Grand." "Oh, you have 2 now?" Another aunt said, the way you might comment on someone having 2 cats. "That's nice, dear. Still cleaning rooms." The table laughed, not meanly necessarily, just that casual dismissiveness of people who think they understand your life and have decided it's smaller than theirs. And I could have let it go, could have smiled and changed the subject like I always did, but I was 53 years old and I was tired of being underestimated by people who should have known better. "Actually," I said, my voice calm and clear, "I don't clean rooms anymore, though I did for many years, and there's no shame in it. I own the Madison Hotel and the Sterling Grand Hotel. I employ 112 people. Last year my properties grossed $14 million in revenue. I'm in the process of acquiring a 3rd property in Brooklyn, which will open in 2 years. And I'm doing all of this without investors or partners, just a loan I've already paid off and profits I've reinvested. So yes, both hotels are doing well." The silence that fell over the table was absolute. People had stopped eating, chopsticks suspended in mid-air, mouths literally hanging open. My mother was staring at me like I'd started speaking a language she didn't understand. David had put down his beer, his eyes narrowed like he was trying to catch me in a lie. 14 million, my Aunt Lily repeated faintly. "In revenue?" "In revenue," I confirmed. "Obviously that's not all profit. There are significant expenses in the hospitality industry. But yes, we're doing quite well." "Why didn't you tell us?" my mother asked, and there was something hurt in her voice, something accusatory, as if I'd been keeping secrets maliciously. "I did tell you," I said gently. "Many times. I told you when I bought the Madison from Robert's estate. I told you when I opened the Sterling Grand. I invited all of you to the opening events. But no one came and no one asked questions, and I got the sense that you weren't really interested in the details of what you all called my hotel job." "The Sterling Grand," David said slowly. "On 5th Avenue? That's Sterling Grand." "Yes," I said. "That one. I had a colleague who stayed there last year for a conference," he said, his voice strange. "He said it was one of the best hotels he'd ever stayed in. He said it cost $600 a night." "Starting rate," I said. "Our suites go higher depending on the season." The dinner continued in a weird fog of stunned silence punctuated by sudden bursts of questions. How had I done it? Where had I gotten the money? Why hadn't I asked the family for help? That last one almost made me laugh, the idea that this family, most of whom were solidly middle class at best, could have helped me acquire and renovate multi-million-dollar properties in Manhattan. But I answered their questions patiently, explaining the years of saving, Robert's initial deal, Eleanor's loan, the strategic decisions about renovation and positioning. I could see them recalculating their understanding of me in real time, adjusting their mental image of poor Maggie who'd dropped out of college and cleaned toilets to this other person, this successful businesswoman they'd somehow failed to notice. "I want to see it," my mother announced suddenly. The hotel. The big one. I want to see what you've built. Me too, said David, and then a chorus of voices, aunts and uncles and cousins all suddenly eager to visit the hotels they'd shown no interest in for years. I arranged it for the following Saturday, inviting the whole family for a tour and dinner at the Sterling Grand's restaurant. I warned my staff that I'd be bringing a large group, that they were family and should be treated well but not differently than any other guests. I didn't want special treatment or showing off, I just wanted them to see the reality of what I'd created. They arrived in a cluster 23 people, overwhelming the lobby with their chatter and their obvious gawking. I watched them take in the space, the marble floors and the soaring ceiling and the restored chandeliers and the art and the elegant furniture. I watched my mother run her hand along the concierge desk, her fingers trailing over the polished wood like she couldn't quite believe it was real. I watched David stare at the brass plaque mounted on the wall, the one that listed the hotel's ownership and history. The Sterling Grand Hotel, the plaque read. Originally constructed 1924, renovated and reopened 2018. Owned and operated by Margaret Chin, in memory of Robert Sterling, hotelier and mentor. My name. Right there on the wall, in brass letters that caught the afternoon light streaming through the tall windows. Not as an employee, not as a manager, but as the owner. The person responsible for this entire beautiful space and everything it represented. My mother started crying, standing there in the middle of the lobby, tears streaming down her face while my aunts fussed around her asking if she was okay. I'm proud, she said, looking at me. I'm so proud, Maggie. I'm sorry I didn't understand. I'm sorry I didn't see. The tour took 2 hours, showing them guest rooms and suites and the restaurant and the spa and the rooftop terrace where we hosted events. I introduced them to staff members, many of whom had worked with me for years, who told my family stories about how I ran the business, how I remembered every employee's name and asked about their families, how I'd helped several of them become American citizens, how I'd promoted people based on merit rather than credentials. I could see my family seeing me differently, understanding finally that this wasn't just a job or even just a business, it was a legacy, something I'd built from nothing through decades of work and sacrifice and strategic thinking. Dinner in the restaurant was surreal, sitting at a long table surrounded by my family while other diners ate around us, wealthy New Yorkers and international travelers who'd paid premium prices to experience what I'd created. The chef came out to greet us, a young woman who'd been a line cook when I'd hired her and who I'd sent to culinary school, paying her tuition in exchange for a commitment to work for me for 5 years after graduation. She brought out special dishes, tasting portions of her most popular creations, and my family ate in relative silence, overwhelmed by the quality and presentation and the realization that this was mine, that I'd made this possible. Why didn't you flaunt this? David asked me over dessert, his voice genuinely confused. Why didn't you make sure we knew? Most people in your position would be bragging constantly. I thought about his question, about the years of being dismissed and underestimated, about the choice I'd made consciously or unconsciously to let them keep underestimating me. Because it wasn't about proving anything to you, I said finally. It was about building something that mattered to me, something that would last. Your approval or understanding was never the goal. The work was the goal. But I'd be lying if I said there wasn't satisfaction in their reactions, in watching them realize they'd been wrong about me for decades. Not vindictive satisfaction exactly, but something quieter, a sense of completion, of a narrative finally being set straight. They'd thought they knew my story, the disappointing daughter who'd wasted her potential, and it turned out they'd been reading it wrong the entire time. The family dynamic shifted after that day. People started coming to me for advice about business and investing. My mother bragged about me to her friends at the senior center, showing them photos of the hotel on her iPad. David asked if I'd talk to his daughter about entrepreneurship, about paths to success that didn't involve traditional credentials. Cousins who'd barely acknowledged me at family gatherings suddenly wanted to have lunch, to hear my story in detail, to understand how I'd done it. It was gratifying but also slightly annoying, this sudden interest after so many years of dismissal. But I engaged with it gracefully, because that's who I'd become through all those years of service work. Someone who understood how to make people feel valued even when I didn't particularly want to. I talked to David's daughter, a bright 16-year-old who was feeling pressured to become a doctor like her father but who had dreams of studying architecture. I told her that the straight path isn't the only path, that sometimes the detours teach you things you'd never learn otherwise, That success can look a million different ways and none of them are wrong if they're authentically yours. I had coffee with my mother once a week now, something we'd never done before, sitting in the cafe at the Madison and talking about her life, her childhood in Taiwan, her early years in New York, things she'd never shared when I was younger because we'd all been too busy surviving to reminisce. She told me she'd always worried about me, worried that I'd given up too much to help the family, that I'd sacrificed my own future to make things easier for everyone else. She said she'd been ashamed not of what I was doing but of the fact that I'd had to do it, that they'd needed my help so badly that I'd had to abandon my education. But you didn't abandon it, I told her. I just took a longer path. And I learned things in those years that no classroom could have taught me. I learned how to work with people, how to see what needs to be done and do it without being asked, how to turn constraints into creativity. Those years weren't wasted, Mama. They were just different than what you'd hoped. The third property, the one in Brooklyn, opened right before my 51st birthday. It was smaller than the Sterling Grand, 42 rooms, in a converted warehouse in Dumbo with views of the Brooklyn Bridge and the Manhattan skyline. I called it the Madison Bridge, connecting it to my first property, creating a family of hotels rather than just separate entities. It was immediately successful, attracting a younger demographic, tech workers and artists and people who wanted Brooklyn authenticity with Manhattan luxury. I was approached by investors now, people wanting me to expand faster, to franchise the concept, to take the company public. But I declined every offer. I'd built this slowly and carefully, and I wasn't interested in explosive growth that would require me to sacrifice control or quality. I was making more money than I could spend, living comfortably but not extravagantly, still driving the same Honda I'd bought 7 years ago, still shopping at the same grocery stores I'd always used. The wealth was security, not lifestyle, and my lifestyle was already exactly what I wanted. My father had died before seeing any of this, before knowing what I'd built, and that was the one regret that still hurt sometimes. He died thinking I'd wasted my potential, and I'd never gotten to show him otherwise, never gotten to prove that his sacrifices hadn't been for nothing, that his daughter had built something significant even if it didn't look like what he'd imagined. But I talked to him sometimes anyway in my head, telling him about the hotels and the employees and the legacy. I hoped somehow he knew that wherever he was, he understood finally that I hadn't failed, I just succeeded in a different language than the one he spoke. On the 10-year anniversary of the Sterling Grand's opening, I hosted a party for everyone who'd been part of the journey. Staff from all 3 properties, Eleanor who'd believed in me when no one else would, Robert's daughter who'd flown in from California and who told me her father would have been proud, regular guests who'd become friends over the years. We took over the entire restaurant and the rooftop terrace, and I gave a speech that I'd written and rewritten a dozen times, trying to capture what these 10 years had meant. I grew up believing that success looked a certain way, I told the crowd. That it meant specific credentials and specific careers and a specific path from point A to point B. And when my life didn't follow that path, I thought I'd failed. But what I learned, what all of you helped me learn, is that success is really just building something that matters, something that serves others and creates value and lasts beyond your own life. These hotels aren't just businesses. They're communities. They're places where people mark important moments, celebrate milestones, find rest in the middle of chaotic lives. They're employment and opportunity for over 200 people now. They're proof that you can start from nothing, from cleaning rooms and scrubbing toilets, and build something extraordinary if you're willing to work hard and learn constantly and care about what you're creating. The applause when I finished was thunderous, and I stood there feeling more seen and appreciated than I ever had at any family gathering, surrounded by people who understood not just what I'd accomplished but how hard I'd worked for it. My family was there too, my mother in the front row beaming, David and his family, various cousins and aunts and uncles who'd made the effort to come. They were part of my story, even the difficult parts, even the years of being underestimated and dismissed. Because maybe those years had fueled me in ways I hadn't recognized at the time, had given me something to prove even though I told myself I wasn't trying to prove anything. I'm 53 years old now, the same age Robert was when he first hired me as a housekeeper at the Madison 31 years ago. I own 3 successful hotels in New York City, properties valued at approximately $42 million with no debt and consistent profitability. I employ 207 people, many of them first-generation immigrants like my parents, working their way toward their own versions of the American dream. I've established a scholarship fund for hospitality workers who want to go back to school, paying full tuition and providing stipends for living expenses, Because I remember what it was like to choose between education and survival, and I want others to not have to make that choice. My family treats me differently now, with respect and interest and even awe sometimes. We have better relationships than we did before that day in the Sterling Grand's lobby, more honest communication, deeper understanding. But I won't lie and say it doesn't still sting sometimes, knowing they couldn't see my worth until it was literally mounted on a wall in brass letters, until my success was undeniable and public and impressive enough to overcome their preconceptions. Love should be unconditional, support should be consistent, belief should be given freely, especially to family. But life doesn't always work that way, and people are complicated, and I've learned to accept the relationships I have rather than mourning the ones I wish I had. The work continues. I'm always looking at new properties, new opportunities, new ways to grow while maintaining the quality and values that made my hotel successful in the first place. I'm mentoring young people in the industry, especially women and immigrants and others who don't fit the traditional mold of hospitality leadership. I'm serving on boards for tourism and small business organizations, using my experience and resources to help others succeed. I'm living fully in this life I've built, this unexpected beautiful life that started with cleaning rooms and led to owning the building. And sometimes when I'm walking through the lobby of the Sterling Grand in the evening, when the chandeliers are lit and the marble glows warm and guests are checking in for stays they've been planning for months, I'll glance up at that brass plaque on the wall. My name, Margaret Chin, owner and operator, proof of a journey that no one expected, including myself. And I'll think about that dinner in Flushing when my family laughed about my little hotel, and I'll smile not with bitterness but with satisfaction, because the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's building something so undeniably excellent that the truth speaks for itself and you don't have to say a word.